Unit 7, Urbanization. Content Objectives 7.3, discuss the characteristics of a CBD. And Content Objective 7.4, explain the challenges cities face. I can statements for 7.3, discuss the characteristics of a CBD. I can statement 1, define characteristics of a central business district, or also known as a CBD. 2. Explain how the CBD is characterized by intensive land use. 3. Explain how all specialized services cluster in the CBD. When we look at the downtown of a city, it's usually the following characteristics. It's the oldest part, and the district is quite visible, with the most visible infrastructural feature, that being a skyscraper. Planned out differently from region to region, but this area is also known as the Central Business District. Hence, going back to our previous knowledge, we know that services that cluster in the largest cities, the largest settlements will form cities. Cities will continue to grow because the hinterland of specialized services will grow. Thus, that would be the Central Business District, where we see the common infrastructural feature of skyscrapers. Can you find the CBD? If you guessed where major interstates intersect, that would be one clue as to where the CBD is. The downtowns of both St. Paul and Minneapolis. All right. Well, let's just go through this. Retail activities. Activities with a high threshold and high hinterland or high range will be located in the city. Activities that serve the CBD workers or those that work downtown. Many retail activities move to the suburban malls. So much of CBDs today are no longer located. The retail services, consumer services, are no longer located in the CBD. They've moved with the intra-regional migration of people to the suburbs. So consumer services most have moved to the suburbs. Business services, activities that serve the interests of others. And this is business services connect people of various businesses. And you'll need face-to-face interaction. That's why business services are still clustered in the CBD. And we can see New York, Fifth Avenue, New York City, and Michigan Avenue in Chicago. Large retailers would be found in older cities like Chicago and New York. Nicollet Mall of Minneapolis. The results of high demand for space in CBD leads to intensive land use. The most expensive land is going to be found in the CBD. We can take a look at Monaco and very expensive land, and that goes for most major cities. The most intensive land use, the obvious sign is going to be skyscrapers, because you can no longer build out, but you have to build up. That shows intensive land use. And with that intensive land use, we'll see extensive use of transportation systems with tunnels below the CBD, with parking ramps that are many levels, and then major transportation systems spiking into the city. These all are examples of the intensive land use of CBDs. And with that being said, there will be very little room for resident or industries. Most industries, as we learned in our previous unit, have moved to one-story buildings outside the interstate and suburbs. And we can look of how expensive it is near the central cities of some of the major cities in the world. And we see, again, examples of intensive land use with high prices of land in Tokyo with this elevator car ramp. And we can see with this intensive land use with podular naps, that's almost designed in large apartment pods. Again, we can see the intensive land use with how small the living quarters are in Tokyo. And again, showing the small living quarters in Tokyo. And when we look at the tallest buildings in the world, it just tells us again the size of the range and specialization of business services in those particular cities. The first skyscraper, Chicago. Population density, we can always see it um, in and around or right outside the CBD in the first ring suburbs. We can see examples of gentrification here where people moving back to the CBD. All right, 7.4. Explain the challenges cities face. ICANN Statement 1. Define and explain filtering and redlining. 2. Define gentrification and evaluate the pros and cons to the controversial urban planning. What physical issues do inner cities face? The most significant problem is quality of housing. Large homes are often they're Victorian-style homes that were occupied by wealthier residents in the early 1900s. Now in the 2000s, they're subdivided by landlords, which is called filtering. They'll subdivide these apartments and sell the complexes to increase the revenue for the landlord. And oftentimes, these landlords do not keep up with the adequate maintenance needs of these houses, and so it leads to a harsher quality of life for those that are living in these filtered apartments or condominiums. Condominiums less so. Upkeep of properties suffers, as I mentioned. Redlining prevents repairs. Redlining is when realtors take a map and they draw a red line in the areas they will not give bank loans to certain people. And predominantly it's been the Black American Hispanic class that has been redlined, meaning they were not allowed to get loans to buy houses in certain areas. That's called redlining. And then buildings are often abandoned in central business districts. We can see the effect of abandoned buildings of the Rust Belt in the Northeast industrial regions or industrial major cities like Cleveland or Detroit or Flint, Michigan. And then we also see the suffering of business services. Urban renewal is a project to eradicate some of these problems. So what does urban renewal look like? They're trying to clean up the rundown neighborhoods. Urban renewal looks different in the 60s and 70s than it does today. In the 60s and 70s, they forced low-income families out into these large multiple unit complexes that were in the city along a major interstate. Some we see in downtown Minneapolis with the Seward neighborhood. You can see it there in Chicago with, if you're familiar with Chicago, with the Cabrini Green neighborhood. New housing may be different. New housing may be different now because government subsidizes, and what we see in the 2000s is a shift away from these large apartment skyscrapers, and now we see the intermixing of neighborhoods and suburbia with Section 8 housing. So you have the intermixing in suburbia, and then what we see in the central business districts or the central city is gentrification, improvements in repair that draws the middle class back to the city. And mostly it draws them because it's closer to work, and the style of the house offers customization of architectural features that are historically relevant in comparison to suburbia that has tract housing, that has mass building of housings that are very similar in structure and similar in architectural veneer or aesthetics. And here's Detroit. Again, abandonment as a result of loss of industrial jobs, deindustrialization. We can look at most of the residents in the 1920s would have been in and around the central cities of both St. Paul and Minneapolis. I-94, when white flight happened in the 1950s, 60s, the Rondo neighborhood was constructed, and the Rondo neighborhood was built along I-94, and it was an enclave for African or Black Americans. Riverside Plaza, as I mentioned, this is in the Seward neighborhood, and this is near an area of Somali enclaves. where again we look at the enclaves of Black Americans and Hispanic Americans predominantly found in urban areas. And we see the movement of some of the Section 8 housing out to outer city regions. We see urban renewal with the construction of large apartment complexes. We see gentrification, dilapidated buildings that are now being renovated. Dilapidated on the right and renovated on the left. Gentrification fears. When we look at the light rail, the third extension of the Central Corridor, it goes right through the heart of some ethnic neighborhoods, and with that comes noise pollution. You have transportation pollution. You have the destruction of the cultural landscape. All right, 7.4. Continue with explaining the challenges of the cities. These I can statements explain the characteristics of the underclass in urban enclaves. 2. Explain 2 ways that local government can remedy problems of the central city. And 3. Describe how megapolis and metropolitan statistic areas further define urban regions. The underclass are those that are trapped in a cycle of poverty. Characteristics are high unemployment, crime, drugs, etc. Poor access to schools. It leads to the technological divide, where you have wealthier residents in suburbia through property taxation, low amounts of property tax revenue goes into inner city. So, and with high unemployment, less money, less property taxes, and less technology, less advancement in schooling, less quality of teachers, healthcare, housing, childcare. They typically have high birth rates. They tend to have children at a very young age, which can create a huge problem. If we go back to our population pyramids, that would again put more strain on the labor sector, those that provide for the youth dependence. Neighborhood clustering often happens. And we can see violence as a result to this underclass in these impoverished conditions. The economic issues cities face, there's a large low-income population that has a very low tax base. Assistance from the U.S. and state governments has declined. And then they also, cities are forced ways to manage, and they can do one of two things. They can reduce the services or they can raise taxes. Neither one most people want. All right, so state government aid, where is it going? When we try to define urban areas, we can break it down into key terms such as metropolitan statistic areas, or MSAs. That's a functional region, typically in a county, follows county lines a lot of times, and the population has to be 50,000 or more. Megapolises are overlapping MSAs, so overlapping functional regions that are usually county functional regions that overlap, or megapolises. The second largest megapolis in the world stretches from all the way from Boston through the Washington Corridor down to northern parts of Virginia. And then we also see a megapolis that stretched along Lake Michigan from Milwaukee to Chicago. Those are overlapping MSAs. All right, looking at population densities and distributions. What is density gradient? That's the density of housing with the distance from the city center. In other words, as you get further from the city center, there's less dense housing. A density housing gradient is found with how we look at land availability in suburbs. The houses are spread out. There's more grass and larger plots of land, less people. That's density gradient within cities. The peripheral urban model states very similar to the concentric zone model, but we'll see more population that's densely populated near that CBD within the peripheral model. But then we'll see now what will happen is the advancement of peripheral model. Now we see nodes in suburbia, and suburbia now will draw larger population densities, which begins to show us urban sprawl. It's like Swiss cheese. You have big spaces between large nodes that would be known as edge cities, those on the edge of the CBD. And urban sprawl creates many problems. All right, can you go ahead and label the following on this peripheral model? Where are the edge cities? The belt line I didn't talk about. The belt line is the interstate that goes around. And inside that belt line will be the central city. Outside that belt line will be the periphery or the suburban regions. All right, again, we look at population distribution here in the metropolitan statistic area of Minneapolis and St. Paul. Urban sprawl, it's poorly planned development. We see that it's mostly consumer services that push out to edge cities, so they're self-contained cities that creates wide open space between those nodes on the periphery. It also creates more roads. It creates more use of utilities. And again, it creates poor use of land where land's spread out that's not densely populated, so that means more car use to drive far distances. You can take a look here in Woodbury. You can see urban sprawl and the poor planning. Then you have cars that have to travel. If you leave your house, everyone drives. There's not walking distance to the mall, or walking distance to the hospital, or walking distance to consumer services. So it increases dependence on cars and the pollution emissions, the carbon emissions of cars. To fight urban sprawl, we see several cities use smart growth plans, so they limit the use of sprawl. The most common is found in Portland, Oregon, that uses a smart growth plan. So they redevelop the inner cities. They create more pedestrian-friendly suburbs. So they connect nodes through walkways, creating more options for mass transit, trying to encourage more use of mass transit. How do they do that? They provide mass transit that connects the central city to the suburbs. They mix business and residential development. So again, less use of car, more pedestrian friendly, accessing to homes and business services. Then they also use smarter use of space, smaller yards, denser housing populations, houses closer together. What would a suburb look like? Well, the suburb of the future might incorporate one of these four pictures, where we see the mixture of lower left of mixed development of business services and residential living. Upper left, dense housing. Upper right, more use of mass transit, eliminate the use of a car. And then the picture to the right shows another mixed development neighborhood. All right, growth of suburbs. We see the growth from the 1950s, and they continue to grow. Change in blocks. So we can see where suburbs are growing, that spread out growth. You have where we live here in South Washington County, the northern cities, Eden Prairie, Eagan, Inver Grove Heights. So we can see this spread out problems of suburban sprawl. And now we see continuous suburban sprawl in like Lakeville. All right, there's a look at urban sprawl. What is suburban segregation? It's when housing develops are usually built to serve one single social class. They can do it by zoning ordinance, city zoning ordinances that creates little affordable housing in suburbs. They can also do it with zoning ordinances where they put shopping or retail industries. So again, retail has left the central city and has been found out in suburbs, and those retail centers again need higher social classes with expendable income to buy those services, and there's less opportunity for low income. All right, so we can look at language, and it also helps us look at the distribution of segregation. We can look at home ownership and how that leads to segregation of social classes. We can look at Cottage Grove. All right. Again, transportation issues. Smart plans, low density land, use walkability, mass transit, eliminate the use of cars. Government subsidizes over 90% of all roads in the United States. Public transportation is most widely used in the Northeast, where we see the fifth largest population cluster in the world. Petroleum prices, again, vary. Public transportation, pros and cons. Pros are carry a large amount of people, less traffic congestion, less cost to operate, less fuel consumption, less pollution. Transportation systems, um, some of the drawbacks are minimally used in major cities outside of the Northeast. Our country's been built on the car, so many people are reluctant to ride mass transit. We see the resurgence of mass transit, but now recently we look at the COVID-19 pandemic and eliminating the use of public transportation. All right, this shows the plan of public mass transportation here in Minneapolis, St. Paul. Okay. All right.